Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Zeeva Bukai. I have been told to tell you that there is a book market upstairs where we will be signing books at the end of this session, and the other authors also, anybody that you're seeing today, will also be signing books upstairs. We're very excited to be here, and we're going to start with Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Blumberg-Kason. I live in Chicago, and I have written 2 biographies, a memoir, and the biography I'm going to talk about today is called Bernardine's Shanghai Salon. It's about a Jewish woman from Peoria, Illinois, who goes to Shanghai in 1929 and starts a salon there, and then it turns into a theater company. So that's the book I'm going to be talking about.
Shelly Sanders.
Yes, I'm Shelly Sanders from Toronto, Ontario. And just a fun fact, my grandmother actually graduated from Berkeley University in 1929, and I'm wearing her class ring, which is very special to me. So this is very special to be here speaking. And so I'm going to be talking about 2 of my books. I'm the author of 5, all Jewish novels. Daughters of the Occupation came out in 2022, and it kind of reflects my own discovery of my Latvian Jewish roots and my discovery of my own Holocaust narrative, as well as the intergenerational trauma that I have experienced and is becoming a lot more important and to talk about. And the second book is The Night Sparrow, which came out last year, again with Harper, and it's about the first female Jewish sniper in the Red Army in World War II. And there were, there were 2,500 female snipers, and a number of them were Jewish, and so that's what The Night Sparrow is about.
Hi, my name is Zeeva Bukai. I'm from New York City, and I'm the author of the novels The Anatomy of Exile, which just won the National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. It is about, thank you, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really exciting. It's about an Israeli family that immigrates to the United States after the death of a beloved sister in what appears to be a terror attack, but is in fact a love affair with a Palestinian poet that ends in tragedy. The family moves to the United States, and lo and behold, a Palestinian family moves into the apartment upstairs. The daughter falls in love with the Palestinian son, and Tamar, the protagonist of the book, does everything in her power to break up that relationship. My second novel, which came out in February, The World Between, is about a former Yiddish stage actress who, after the end of her marriage with her playwright husband, Max, returns to Tel Aviv to the apartment that she shared with him there, but very soon after finds herself at the Sisters of the St. Joseph of the Apparition Hospice, a sanitarium, and she's not quite sure how she got there. And so her psychiatrist tells her, write a letter to your husband. And the entire book is about her trying to piece together the events that brought her to this moment. The novel goes from New York City to Tel Aviv, and also to Siberia, where she was in a children's home, an orphanage, in a labor camp. It is about childhood war trauma. It is about the Yiddish theater. It is about parents and children. It's about a lot of things, and it's a very short book. A friend of mine called it an epic novella. So anyway, so we're going to start with the one question that I think many of us have, and that is, what is a Jewish story? What makes it a Jewish story? What are the characteristics? So we're going to start with Susan and move down the line.
Thank you so much. So I think a Jewish story has to be told very intentionally, and that it's not just a Jewish author or a non-Jewish author who has Jewish characters, but there has to be this intentional feeling throughout the writing process. So I look at book covers and the inside flap, and if it's a Jewish writer, but the names of the characters aren't Jewish, if they're like Irish or German or something, then I know it's not a Jewish story. So the example I want to use is my book, Bernardine's Shanghai Salon. Bernardine is Jewish. Her cousin, Henrietta Zold, started Hadassah. So she comes from a Hungarian Jewish family. She goes to Shanghai at the age of 33 to marry her fourth husband. And she's what we would call secular. But when she's in Shanghai, she meets people in the Jewish community, whether it's Baghdadi Jews or Russian Jews or the very early German Jewish refugees from Hitler's, Germany, and also American and British expats who are Jewish. But she also is friends with people like Charlie Chaplin, who comes through Shanghai at the time, with Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I choose to focus on her Jewish friends because I'm telling a Jewish story, and those were really, truly her closest friends in Shanghai, and she flocked to them, I think without even realizing that she felt more comfortable with them. And there's a Russian Jewish composer who was trained as a doctor, and then he decided he wanted to write Chinese ballets. He wanted to compose Chinese ballets. Had no connection to China. He actually came to San Francisco to practice medicine because he finished his medical training in Switzerland right around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, and his parents said, don't come back. So he came to San Francisco, realized he didn't like medicine, and so he moved to China and composed all these Chinese ballets based on Chinese folktales, and he showed up at one of Bernardine's salons, and she wouldn't let him leave before he agreed to let her produce one ballet, and then it turned into two. So I feel like focusing on things like that makes it a Jewish story. If I had focused more on when George Bernard Shaw came there and Bernardine meeting him after she had been there for a couple of years, that wouldn't have really, to me, been a Jewish story. It would have just been this American expat in Shanghai. So it's really how I structured that story around these other Jewish friends. And then when she came to LA after 1937 when she left, and she got involved in Jewish causes during World War II. So I include that too.
Okay, I guess I'll talk about The Night Sparrow, which, as I have mentioned earlier, is about a female Jewish sniper, and they were the first female snipers. This platoon was all female, and they were the first female snipers in the Red Army in World War II, and a number of them were Jewish. And so my female sniper is an amalgam of the Jewish women, and of course, I could, if I hadn't done it from the point of view of a Jewish woman, it would have been a completely different story, because the Jewish women, they had a very different experience, subtly but different, because they were, religion was banned in the Soviet Union, so a lot of them didn't really know what it meant to be Jewish, and we see that now with Soviet writers here in the States, where they don't know what it means to be Jewish because they weren't allowed to be raised with it, and so their books may have nothing to do with Judaism, and yet they are Jewish authors. So that kind of gets into that conundrum of, is it Jewish or not? And I don't know, but in this case, I did it from Elena's point of view, and she, being Jewish, had to put up with the fact that when they encountered mass graves of Jews, the Stalin rhetoric was, they are not Jews, they are Soviet citizens, and so she had to, put up with this idea that Jews were not being targeted. Meanwhile, she had, and many Jews had seen her family murdered at Babi Yar, or in ghettos, like she's from Minsk, and she had seen all of these things, and they knew that Jews were being persecuted. And so the other thing that's kind of interesting is many families by this time, because of the propaganda in Stalin's time, some spouses were kind of gave up their Judaism and became really staunch communists, and that's what Elena's character, her parents, her father retains his Judaism, and her mother has become a total communist and has shunned her Judaism. And so there's, that was actually quite common, and so people were raised without really this kind of torn, but idea, this torn identity. But she did have the benefit from her father of learning a few things. So she did have a sense of Judaism in her soul. And so this story, would have been, as I said, completely different without it, and it was a completely different time. And it affects, you see, as she's going through the war, it really affects her view of other people. It affects her Judaism. It affects, what she thinks about the future. So that is something that was, I think, really important in the story to look at it from this point of view. And so, but as I said before, that there are books by Jewish authors, like Soviet Jewish authors that have nothing to do with Judaism as well. I will point to Tobias Wolff, an author I really admire, and he only has written one book that alludes to his Jewishness, because he, like me, didn't find out he was Jewish till he was an adult, and he was raised by his Catholic mother. His father was Jewish. And so his books, you would not know he's a Jewish author. So are his books, Jewish? He had one book that I think came out in 2003 that was with kind of where the protagonist actually hides his Judaism to fit in, which is what I think happened within his family. So again, you get into this whole argument of, are they Jewish? Is he a Jewish author? Isn't he? And my answer is, I don't know. But that's sort of where I am at.
So for me, the whole idea of a Jewish book is also one, who the characters are, obviously. A lot of my characters are either Israeli or they are Jews who were forced into exile in Siberia. But I also think it's this idea of incorporating Jewish themes. I had worked in a yeshiva for girls for many years, teaching English literature. And the Rebbitzin there, the woman who ran the school, said to me once, "The Jewish soul is always longing." And for me, one of the big themes in my work is this element of longing. And it's also the element of memory. And on Friday night, I went with a friend to a service on Friday evening at a synagogue. And what was interesting to me is, at some point they're saying the Kaddish, right, in memory of the dead. And I thought that in Judaism, there is this idea that we're always remembering those who were before us. And for me, my writing, and it's fiction, and yet the strongest elements there for me are the things that I'm remembering, the stories that my grandmother told me, the stories that my parents told me about their lives. My father was a Mizrahi Jew from Syria, from Damascus. And so those stories permeate my work. And so those kinds of themes, the struggle of the Jewish people throughout history, is something that I'm really interested in. That sense of memory, that sense of longing. And then in my recent novel, The World Between, besides her being a Yiddish actress, there's this element, it's called The World Between, and there's this idea of the Nishtahain, Nishtahel, the neither here nor there, the world in between, the world between the earth, the concrete earth, and heaven. And there's this section there where her father she asks her father where the soul goes. And he tells her that the Jewish soul, when it leaves the body, shatters into hundreds of pieces and rises into the ether. And from there attaches itself to other bits of Jewish souls until an entire soul is created and then born into the body of the next Jew that's being born. And this is a Kabbalistic idea that I incorporated. And so for me, definitely writing Jewish characters. I don't think personally that I can write anybody else. I mean, I can, but it's where I tend to go. And incorporating these themes, biblical allusions, the sense that history is not just, that Jewish history is not just today, and it isn't just the Holocaust, but it is far beyond that. are all things that I feel are part of the Jewish story. So one of the questions that we had for ourselves was this idea of where we place these stories impacts both the stories and why we choose those places. Was a question that we had when we were talking about this panel. So I don't know, Shelly, do you want to begin, and Susan follow? Yeah.
So place is really inextricable in all of my books. They would not exist without place. Daughters of the Occupation, for example, I feel like the place chose me because in 2016 I discovered that my ancestors had come from Latvia, and in fact our roots, I've subsequently found out that our roots go back there till the late 1700s. And so I knew none of this. So I traveled to Riga and for the first time, and discovered on the first day, I found out why my grandmother was born in Siberia, because her father had been exiled in 1905 for being involved in a workers' uprising. And then the next day I went to the archivist and discovered for the first time that she told me I had sent information ahead of time, and she had a desk set up with documents and said, these are your relatives, 26 of your relatives, and they were all killed in the Holocaust, in the Rumbula massacre. And I had read about that before coming, and I had no idea that this was part of my narrative. And so that was shocking, upending, like completely changed my sense of who I was, my identity, but it also made me, I think, really, I had to know more about Latvia. I've been many times now, and even had a writing residency there last year. And place has become very important to me, and that book would not be there without that, because people didn't know about Rumbula and the Latvian Holocaust because they were occupied by the Soviets till '91, and they still don't talk about it. Like, one of the most common phrases I got was, people don't want to talk about what happened to the Jews when I go and ask questions in Riga and Daugavpils. So the place is just so important in my novel. In that novel, it is actually essential to that novel. And I think that, I don't know, I think that place is so important in many novels that we read, and especially, I don't know, in Jewish novels, because of what happened in the history. And for me, finding all of this out when I finally, picked my jaw up off the floor, it made me compelled to write about it. And that's when the vision for Daughters of the Occupation began in my head, because I want to tell these unknown stories, and they all have these separate places. And the same can be said with The Night Sparrow. It had to be in the Soviet Union, the only country that allowed women in combat. The story would not be possible without the Soviet Union allowing women and that so-called equality. So again, place is essential in my books, and I keep seeing that it will be essential, down the road as I continue to write.
Great, Susan.
Yeah, that's very similar. Oh, can you hear? Yeah. That's very similar to me too. My background is actually in China and Hong Kong, and I first went to Shanghai in 1988, right after I graduated high school. And I went again in 91 when I was studying abroad in Hong Kong for a year. And then I went again in 95 when I was in graduate school in Hong Kong, and I was married to a man from central China at the time. And I wrote a memoir about that. That was my first book. But in 1995, when I went back to Shanghai, it had totally changed from 1991 and 1988. And the reason was because before that, anything before 1949 was taboo. And in 1995, there was this opening. And in all the advertisements, in movies, in bookstores, newspapers, I saw these beautiful photos of the 1930s in Shanghai. And I learned that there was a big Jewish community there. And that was actually plural. There was probably about 800 Baghdadi Jews, 10,000 Russian Jews that had come. The Baghdadi Jews had come in the mid-1800s, and then the Russian Jews came before and after the Bolshevik Revolution. And then there were, the very conservative number I've heard is 17,000 German and Austrian and Eastern European Jews that escaped Hitler's Europe. And there were also hundreds of expats from the US and the UK that were Jewish that weren't there permanently. They were there for jobs. But the others were there because they had nowhere else to go. And the Baghdadis were there just because they had been there for a long time doing business. And this opened my world because I had been so interested in China, and this was a totally different perspective. And at that time, I read a book by an Austrian Jewish woman named Vicky Baum. Her book, Grand Hotel, became optioned into Hollywood. That was a big Hollywood movie. It was the first book where a hotel was like the center point of a story, and there's all these different people going in. And she did that in Shanghai. And the book that I read in 1995 was called Shanghai 37. And she wrote that, I think, in 1939 or so. And it was about, there were Jews, and there were Russians, and French, and Germans, and Japanese, all in this hotel that was modeled after Victor Sassoon's Cathay Hotel, which is now the Peace Hotel. It's, if you've ever been to Shanghai or seen photos, it's got a very bright, like emerald green pyramid roof, and the hotel's still there. So I wanted, this was what I wanted to study. I tried to study for my master's degree about tea houses in Shanghai and how that fostered civil society, and my professor said there's no proof of that. You don't have any firsthand documents about that. It may be true, but I just did something that he wanted to do about little parliaments, and so it's always been like I've wanted to write something really creative about Shanghai, and from 1995 I just read every single not every single one, but a lot of books about Jewish Shanghai. And so that, it's been over 30 years. And I feel like there's always something new to learn. And there's a lot of books about this, but a lot of people don't know this history. So it's like telling a new story that's been told a lot. And so that's why I was so focused on Shanghai. And then the Jewish part just came after that.
So in terms of place for me, I was born in Israel, and so a lot of my stories take place there. And I was also an immigrant to New York City, and so my stories take place there as well. But when I really kind of began writing seriously, I began writing about other places that my parents had lived in. And so I wrote about Siberia, and I wrote about Damascus, Syria. And so those places became, even though I had never been there, those places became palpable to me in a way. And I was interested in the Jewish, Haret El Yahud, the Jewish quarter in Syria that my father would tell me about. And so those stories, I would ask him things, well, what did it look like? And he would tell me stories about how his mother would cook in a courtyard, and it was a kind of main courtyard where other houses, right? Other women would come and cook in this courtyard. And so the cooking was kind of this communal thing. Stories like that really kind of fired my imagination. In terms of Israel, there's a lot about Israel in my work, most especially Tel Aviv, where I lived, and a city that I feel very close to and very at home in. And of course, New York City. In writing The Anatomy of Exile, I placed the family in New York, in Brooklyn, on the same street, in the same building that I and my family lived in. It felt very fertile to me. I grew up there, I was a kid there, and I kind of understood the dynamics of the place. So in that sense, I wanted to kind of go back, and again, this idea of memory is very important to me as a kind of canvas from which to kind of pick from, and also the time frame. Like when I think of place, I also think of time and where I place these stories. And so the stories are usually placed between the sometimes the Second World War, or actually the aftermath of the Second World War. I rarely write about the Second World War itself, but the aftermath of the war is something that I'm very interested in, and kind of what happened most especially to Jews afterwards. For example, my grandmother returned to her house in Krożnowice, Poland. Someone else was living in the house, and of course, she did not have access to it anymore. And so that idea of exile and displacement and uprootedness, I think, is very much part of the Jewish story. This element of wandering from one place to another is certainly a part of the Jewish story. And the timelines for me that I'm most interested in are from the aftermath of the war, the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, through the 1990s. I don't know why, like if you ask me like why that time frame, I just think it's a time period that I'm very excited about, because I think that massive changes occurred at that time. The most upheaval in terms of people's displacement occurred in the second half of the 20th century. And yeah, that's it. So we move on to our next question is, how do we transform personal history and or Jewish history into our writing? How do we do it? Sure, I'll start. So for me, a lot of it is embedded, as I said before, in the stories that I've been told. And what's exciting to me when I'm writing is actually taking the kind of core of those stories and kind of exploding them outward, right? It's where my imagination comes in. And even though some people in the characters in the stories might be based on my grandmother or my mother or something like that, I give myself license to develop them in a completely different way. That's the excitement for me, where I can kind of combine my own imagination with a specific reality. And I could lie, and it's okay. And, and there's, I could imagine my mother as someone who was, let's say, much stronger than she actually was in real life, or grows in a way that she didn't necessarily grow. I can imagine her that way because I want to imagine her that way. I want to give her that strength, that power, and not just the childhood war trauma. My mother was born in Orsk on the Siberian border, and the family was later moved into a Siberian labor camp. I know that she suffered from childhood war trauma. The first 5 years of her life were spent in an orphanage. Her mother visited her once a week because her mother had to work as a laundress. She was in a labor camp. And so for me, the excitement and this idea of transforming personal history into fiction is about taking something, a garin, the seed of something real, and moving it outwards. So, yeah.
So mine, like I said, I've been interested in Shanghai for so long. So it was like the late 80s, 90s, and then around 2012 or 2013, a genealogist cousin in San Antonio was emailing me, and she sends like the updated family tree. And in passing, she talks about my grandfather's second cousin who went to Shanghai. She had never said anything about this before. She knew I was interested in China. I had lived in Hong Kong. And so I was shocked. I mean, I didn't know we had a relative who was one of those Shanghai refugees. So I asked her for more information, and she gave me everything she knew, but it was like names of cousins in Israel, or this relative was in Shanghai for 8 years, from 39 to 47, and then he settled in Savannah, Georgia. And so there were some relatives there. There were some in Florida, and I wanted to write about him. I'm like, I need to write about this. And as I have a family connection, and I talked to relatives in Israel and in Florida, and they had no firsthand documents. He had married a first cousin, and it was just to get him over from Shanghai in 1947. And she was 10 years older, but they ended up, and there were a lot of first cousin marriages, but it turned out to be a really lovely marriage, no children. And she died, and he was really upset, and so he quickly married again, and that wife threw away all of his papers. So anything from Shanghai, anything from the family in America writing to him, his brother and parents were wiped out in the Holocaust. And so I put together a proposal. I had a literary agent. She was super interested in this. And she sent it to publishers, and they just weren't interested because they said there was nothing firsthand. There were no letters. If there had been letters, it would have been something. And so it's kind of dead on arrival. And I was so determined to write a book about Shanghai. I didn't know what it was going to be. So I bought this little library cart. It was this beautiful wooden library cart on wheels, and I stacked it with books about Shanghai. And that was from 2012, 2013. And then in 2018, this Bernadine Zold Fritz's name just kept coming up in all these different books I was reading. And she was Jewish. She lived in Shanghai. And this was a time where in publishing, we were told to just write who we are, and we couldn't write about other cultures. And I thought this was a great way for me to continue my China writing, because it was a Jewish woman from Illinois. I'm from the Chicago area. And that's how Bernadine became the next book. And I actually got a lot of her papers from her cousin David Zanton, who was a professor at Berkeley for many, many years in the anthropology department. And he had papers in his garage, and I helped lift them out. And he had met her once, and she gave him a lot of her writings. And so I was very grateful. I couldn't have done it without him. But it's just like this family story that I couldn't publish changed into something that I could. So that's how Bernadine was written.
For me, I would say Daughters of the Occupation was very much, it came out of my personal life. In fact, my first 3 books were inspired by the discovery of my own Judaism and my grandmother, who was in Russia, and I wrote about the Kishinev pogrom, but it was, I know that her family had suffered and endured a lot in Russia, in Siberia, and so I still didn't know a ton, but so I wrote the Kishinev pogrom, but it was out of her, and I followed that trajectory with Rachel's Promise and Rachel's Hope, which actually had her coming to San Francisco and going to university, the character, which is what my grandmother actually did. So it followed her trajectory, and they actually were in Shanghai. They fled Russia and were in Shanghai at the same time that Bernadine's Shanghai salon. And so I kind of like to think that my grandmother maybe might have attended this salon. I don't know. I will not know for sure. But so, and then for Daughters of the Occupation, as I said, the discovery of this Holocaust narrative, and the first time I went to Rambula and saw the mass graves, and it's this beautiful forest, and then there are these mass graves, and you have 26 relatives. They can't tell you whether it was the November 30th action or the December 8th action that they were killed. They don't know where they are. It is really, I would say, life-changing to see that as an adult, and to realize, and they were all in photos with my grandmother, I should add, all of them, all of the people. And so I knew that she had a relationship with them. As a political exile, they were able to come back in the summer. All the photos are in the summer, back to Riga to visit their family. They had a large extended family there. So I knew she knew them. And in 1929, the year she graduated from Berkeley, she's in Riga with a cousin and his wife pictured. So I know that she, had these relationships with them. And, she died without knowing what happened to them. I mean, she knew their fate was awful, but she died in 78, 77. So, she didn't know. And so it became my mission to, I'm her namesake. She was Rachel, but went by Shelly, and I'm Shelly, and my Hebrew name is Rachel. And it became my kind of mission, my obligation, whatever you call it, to find out what happened to these relatives and to write this story about Rumbulla, which had really altered my family. I grew up without any religion and didn't know anything about my Judaic roots. And I was a child who wanted that kind of spirituality and, would try out churches and all of this sort of thing, and really wanted that sense of a community, that kind of community, and didn't have it. And, I remember when I interviewed my Aunt Nusha, my grandmother's older sister who outlived her, and, after a lot of cajoling, she told me about their life in Siberia a bit, and she talked about a samovar, and I stopped her and said, "What's a samovar?" And she was so upset that I didn't know what a samovar was. And at that point, I realized, there's this cultural, we lost so much. And so that is why I write these stories for my own learning and to grow and to share the stories. And I also write, I mingle the real with the fiction. I use a lot of the real names and all the events. I don't make up any events and I don't exaggerate them. I feel because my family was there and involved in the Holocaust that I want to do tribute to them by writing them as authentically as I can and creating the most authentic characters that I can for my stories. And so that is how that's sort of how I look at my fiction going forward. And probably the best compliment I got was when Daughters came out, I wrote about one of the women who had been taken by the Iraj Commando, a Jewish woman, and they took them into the basement of their headquarters and they raped them repeatedly. And she had survived, and she testified at Nuremberg and did an interview, which you actually can find on YouTube, and Zelma Shaplapowitz, big name, and she did it in English because she wanted the world to know. And I wrote about her in Daughters, and her daughter is in Israel, and somehow got a copy of the book, and contacted me through Facebook to tell me that she really liked the depiction of her mother in the book. And to me, that was, probably the best review I've had, and that's why I continue to write in the way I write.
Yeah, I just want to add to that that I think most especially in fiction, at least for me, that what I'm looking for is an emotional truth and not necessarily a factual truth. That emotional truth, I think, gets at something that sort of leads us kind of into this next question, in the sense that both the factual and the fiction and the nonfiction, I think, can run almost parallel in a way when we think about the kinds of research that we do for these books. Susan, do you want to begin?
Sure. Well, I had the library card, so I had that. The research, but the Bernadine research itself was in California. So her cousin David Zanton in Berkeley. I came here on a day trip in 2019 when I was visiting my mother in Phoenix with my family. I just felt like it was just easier, rather than going from Chicago to Berkeley and then Chicago to LA where the other papers were, I could just use Phoenix when I was with my kids and my husband and my mom, and I could just leave for the day. And so it was when those 737 Maxes were, I don't know if you all remember, but in 2018, Southwest had all these 737 Maxes. There were 2 plane crashes that were pilot error in other countries. So this whole fleet was grounded. And this was the time I was trying to do these day trips. And so I wasn't really sure they were gonna actually be day trips, but they were. So I came to LA I went there first to her cousin Nancy, and she had also hundreds of Bernadine's papers. And Bernadine wrote these vignettes as if she was writing a book, but she never published anything long form. She had wrote for the New Yorker a little bit. And so I got those, and then I went up to Berkeley later that week and got more, and her cousin Nancy flew up from LA, so David and Nancy and I had a lovely day, and we went through the papers. We found photos that they had known about but hadn't seen, and it was just a treasure trove. So that most of her writings were from these 2 home archives. Yale also has in their rare collection library, they have a lot of letters that people wrote to Bernardine. So I have those. And Bernardine was also very close with a lot of Chinese intellectuals. So she was the first person that in Shanghai that brought the Chinese and foreigners together through the arts. So the research, I mean, it was just really lucky that I found these two cousins. And that was just through an online search that led to them. So that was my research.
For me, my search began after I had my first child, and as I said, I didn't know much about, I knew by that time I was Jewish, but didn't know really what to do with it. But I went to visit with my 6-month-old and my mother, my Aunt Nusha in Montreal, and my Aunt Nusha, as an aside, is the impetus for the character in my, for the protagonist in Daughters of the Occupation, Miriam. Anyway, so I went to her very smoke-filled apartment and, got some information out of her, and I saw this box of photos in her room on my way to the bathroom, and being a journalist, I flipped through them and saw many, many of my grandmother as a little girl, and I had seen no photos of my grandmother at that age, none. So I asked my Aunt Nusha if I could have some. Now, she was almost 80 and had glaucoma and could not see, but she said no. So I whispered to my mom to distract her and went back to the room and stuffed photos and even little albums into my clothing and was like layered in bulky stuff and came out to my very, my mother, who is not that way. She's a little more, So anyway, she saw me and we made a very quick exit. And those photos I had to put aside because I had 2 more kids and was working as a freelance journalist. But when I had time to look at them, that's when I discovered the Latvian connection, because in the bottom of the photos was Dvinsk, which was the Yiddish for Daugavpils, which it is today. And I saw Riga, and I was embarrassed to say, I have no idea where Riga is. I knew nothing about it and started researching. And I'm like, why was my grandmother in Riga? What were they doing there? And I have one where she's a little girl and there's all of these people. And I'm like, who are these people? And she had written her name Shelly on the back, and it was very carefully labeled Riga. And I'm like, she was born in Siberia. What's she doing in Riga? Like all of these questions. And so that, thank goodness, the internet was available. And I started doing online searches and found the free website. So there's names and fates, but there's also Jewish Gen, which is amazing. And I was able to plug in names, and I actually got my great-grandparents' marriage certificate in 1905 and found all of these different things from that. And then from that information, booked a trip to Riga, a solo trip, and went and sent the information to the curator of the Jewish Museum and also to the archivist, and went and did on foot, which is my favorite way to do research. And so that's how that kind of evolved. And I knew by the end of that trip I was going to write something. I didn't know what it would be, but every night in my hotel room I just wrote. And it was a very emotional trip because I was finding all this out and I was by myself. And so it was, honestly life-changing. But that's how I did my research. I also interviewed survivor. I found a survivor in New York City. There were a lot of self-published memoirs by survivors that I read as well. I read an academic book. I love research, so I just dove into it and, spent about a year researching as well before I started really in earnest writing the book. So that's how.
Yeah. We have like another, I think, three or 4 minutes. So very quickly, in terms of my own research, my first book takes place between the 1967 war and the 1973 war, so I did quite a bit of research on the 1967 war and how it changed Israel, the sense of euphoria that Israelis felt after the Six-Day War, and then, of course, the devastation that they felt at the Yom Kippur War in 1973. I also asked relatives what life was like, and I heard a story that I did know about my father in this thing called Aliyat HaElef, which was Operation 1,000 Children. And this took place between 1945 and 1946, where the idea was to get 1,000 Syrian Jewish children out of Syria into what was then Palestine. because they were starving. My family, at least, was starving. The situation for them was not good at the time. And so my father was part of this. He was 13 years old. His two brothers, one was 11, the other one was 8. They were smuggled across the Golan Heights on June 6th, 1945. Two of them, the youngest, were placed on Kibbutz Tel Yosef, and my father was placed on Moshav Balforia, where he lived with a Czech couple and needed to learn Yiddish very quickly. My father, who was, an Arabic speaker, spoke fluent Yiddish, and which was something that I found quite funny. That was some of the stories. For my second book, I actually researched Yiddish theater, of course. I studied theater in Israel, and I wound up studying with a former Yiddish actor, and whose brother actually was one of the founders of the Habima Theater, the National Theater of Israel, Nahum Tzemach. So many of those things were kind of incorporated into my book. Finally, our last question, and then we're done. Our last question is, so what makes up a Jewish story? We get back to this, and is it our intention to continue writing Jewish stories? And if so, why? So just very quickly, because we need to wrap up. Shelly, you can start.
Yeah, so I really only found my narrative voice with the discovery of my Jewish ancestry, and it has been, it's a privilege to write, and I feel like it's very important to me to write Jewish stories about these unsung people and little-known stories, and I will always be writing about the Jewish characters and Jewish stories.
Yeah, and for me, going from China to this latest book, or this book, I just want to write Jewish stories. So the Jewish story for me it has to be just it's the focus. And the book I'm working on now is a biography of Golda Meir's childhood and teenage years in Milwaukee and Denver. So whatever I write about, it's very Jewish because it's Golda, but it's been really fascinating, and it's been fun, so.
Yeah. So for me too, I can't imagine not writing a Jewish story. I wouldn't know where to start. And so I continue, I think this idea that we spoke about at the beginning, the idea of intention, the kinds of characters that we're writing, the world that we place them in, the time frame that we place them in, I think all of that helps us create the Jewish story. And as for kind of moving forward, and I'm very, very interested in this idea of childhood war trauma right now. I think it's really important, and I'm very interested in what happened to children in Siberia, and most especially during the Second World War. For me, also, writing Jewish stories today feels like an act of resistance. I'm just going to put it out there. And I think Jewish stories are incredibly important for all of us moving forward. We need them. We need to know what they are. We need to embrace our history and ourselves, basically. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you. Please remember that we will be signing books upstairs at the Bookshuk, and you literally need to kind of go out the door to the right, go through another door, and and upstairs you should find it.
There is an elevator.
There's an elevator, yeah.
And there is an elevator.
And stairs.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.